to record with a tape recorder.
Brad?
Here we go.
Brad,
yes.
You want me to lay out again after that instrumental break and then come back in with the fours toward the end, like before C?
We may have you wail on that, baby, for the instrumental. Here we go! That'll be what?
Take two.
Takes my eyes, she's somehow closer now.
Dark as shame, darling, dark as shame.
Strangers in the night.
Alvin! VTS Los Angeles. 5:00 in Los Angeles.
Would you like to ride in my beautiful balloon?
The Wrecking Crew was the focal point of the music. They were the ones with all the spirit and all the know-how, and especially for rock and roll music.
In the hardcore producing area, everybody knew what went on there. I mean, everybody knew that the best musicians played in all the sessions, but we as the general public didn't know. I had no idea that certain people didn't play their own records until the Monkees came along.
They played so well, and they played so well together. I think they were so into that. They all respected each other, and they all would sit and, talk in between takes and hang. I mean, it was a social event for these guys, too.
What was nice about that unit was that they played together a lot. And so they were an established groove machine. They knew each other. So you could really count on what they had to offer.
That's life.
We played on everybody's Lazy, Crazy, Hazy Days of Summer album with Nat King Cole. It was the same guys doing that was doing the Beach Boys.
The musicians were really the unsung heroes of all those hit records.
When I listen to the record, it is so apparent that these guys were just really so good. And you can see why everybody used them, because they were so tight.
They were the stone-cold rock and roll professionals, and there may never, ever be a group of rock and roll musicians of that caliber again.
Are you ready, Boots?
Start walking.
The chances are you didn't know his name, but it's likely you sang and hummed along with his music. Famed studio guitarist Tommy Tedesco has died.
I'm Kurt Loder with an MTV News Brief. Tommy Tedesco was arguably the king of Los Angeles session guitarists.
You probably never heard his name or heard him speak, but listen, he is someone you've heard before.
He was featured in the theme to Bonanza, in Batman,
The Chores.
The Stars.
Tedesco died of cancer Monday at his home in Northridge, California at the age of 67. While his name may not be immediately familiar to everyone, some aspect of his music almost certainly is.
Here's the irony. You spend your whole life playing guitar, creating guitar licks that people all around the world recognize, but nobody knows your name until you're dead. And then, even in the end, they misspell your name and call you
Tony Tedesco
instead of Tommy. Tommy was not only a legendary guitarist, he was my father, and he was also a member of an elite group of studio musicians. So what follows is the story of my father and his extended family, the Wrecking Crew.
Hondells, Marquettes, Routers. We'd cut the tracks and the records, and then they'd form a group to be that group.
People were really not focused on the long, drawn-out album recording sessions.
4 songs in 3 hours. It's only a certain group of guys can do that.
A lot of the recording came out here. That's when you had an influx of a lot of New York musicians. That was in the mid-'60s when it started flowing out here. But then it became a flood around that time.
This led to a surge of work for the LA studio musicians. Not all of them, but a small group who later became known as the Wrecking Crew.
Twisting the night away. Here they have a lot of fun. Putting trouble.
It wasn't an organized band of musicians that set out to take over rock and roll, and I can't tell you exactly who was part of this hit-making machine. Even the musicians that were part of this scene couldn't come to an agreement.
12, 15 people.
Maybe, 20 of us.
30, maybe?
There was probably 20 musicians, or maybe a few more counting the string players, of course, that were doing all the sessions.
They were a product of like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they were great musicians who came of age when rock and roll came of age, and here they are at the height of their physical powers with all of this talent, and they're in the right place, and it's the right time. And so they get to do this.
On the first day of shooting, I brought 4 of LA's greatest session players together. Carol Kay, Plaz Johnson, and Hal Blaine, along with my father. It was probably the first time that all 4 had been in the same room in about 20 years.
Wait! All you have to do is just get sick. Rolling. Okay, the question is, this is not, we talked...
You know, all the guys that had been in the studios, God bless them all, for 20, 30 years, they all wore the blue blazers, the neckties, and there was no talking and no smoking and no nothing. And we came in there with Levi's and T-shirts, smoking cigarettes, whatever weird. Yeah. And the older guys were saying, they're going to wreck the business. You know, they are going to wreck the music business.
You didn't have the respect that the older guys had. Remember the older studio players, Barney Kessels and the Lloyd Elliots, all these people?
Well, that's how that whole Wrecking Crew thing came in.
Even though the term The Wrecking Crew gained popularity with rock historians, many of these musicians never heard the term until years later.
I think Hal Blaine is the first one I heard it from.
Yeah.
He probably came up with the name.
I think it kind of evolved, really.
There was-
first time I heard the name, I think, was at the Baked Potato when they had that get-together. They used the expression, The Wrecking Crew.
Well, it was used before that. It was used while we were recording.
And the definition of who was a member of The Wrecking Crew, there really isn't any definition.
Between the engineers, producers, and musicians themselves, each has their own take on how this all went down. Together, they form a snapshot of a time that will never be repeated.
Anybody could do 5 or 6 different things on as many different instruments also.
There were a lot of producers at that time that were not really musicians, so these guys were able to decode.
He's talking about me, by the way.
Oh, no, I mean, there were some producers that really just, didn't really know the musician's language, and these guys were able to just quickly interpret it.
The people we're talking about played for so many people in so many different styles. That's a fascinating thing. They could walk into a pop sound and play it. They could do rhythm and blues. They could do soul music. I guess they could have done classics if they'd had to. But they had the magic touch.
We injected a lot of ourselves into it because we were experts at doing it. We were doing it all the time. A guy would give us a lead sheet or something, and we know what the song was. We made up a lot of arrangements and so forth on that set, ourselves on those things.
Here's the way that the beat goes on, sounded when we first heard it. La-di-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, I said, uh-oh, we need to pull a rabbit out of a hat for this one. It was our job to come up with riffs and stuff. So about the third line I came up with was da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. And Sonny loved it, and he gave it to Bob West, the bass player, to play it, and both of us are playing it throughout the tune. And without a good bass line, the tune doesn't pop. It doesn't snap, like a big hit record.
The beat goes on,
I've always said they put notes on paper. They put notes on paper. But that's not music. You make the music. What do you do with the notes? What do you do with the charts? What do you do with the chords?
Other than that, they could call a union for a guitar.
Sure, that's right. So it's what you put into it. Because how many days, in fact, we're all here.
It's what you put into it that's not written.
Yeah. Well, in fact, everybody that's sitting here, I remember doing different things that weren't ever even thought about, and then all of a sudden become part of the record and part of the signature.
We all used to produce our own parts. It's that simple.
To make it swing, yeah.
It was a pretty amazingly small clique, considering we had 40,000 musicians in this town, and there were maybe, 20 of us.
Yeah, it was a very small group of people who were really doing everything.
We really lucked out.
The first thing that I ever did that smacked of any kind of rock and roll was some kind of date, which I don't even know who the artist was. There wasn't a minor seventh chord in a bushel, it was all pretty vanilla. So I knew something was different.
At the time, I was doing the Ozzie and Harriet TV show. Then all of a sudden, I'm doing the show, and then one day they come up with Jimmy Haskell comes up with Ricky Nelson says we're doing this rock and roll stuff. I don't know what they're talking about. Just laid out a chord sheet and says play behind Ricky Nelson. So pretty soon we were starting to get involved in this.
Open up your heart and let this fool rush in.
That's what took me to L.A. in summer of 1960 to play in the Ricky Nelson Band. Working with those people like that was a perfect showcase for what would happen later, which I had no idea that I would ever be the session player. Didn't even know what that meant.
We learned how to play rock and roll right there on the job. Hey, if they want this, I can do it. That's Latin music. That's nothing, You can do that all day long.
There were some purists, like there is in every way of life. Some people will not compromise.
Not that they couldn't, they wouldn't most of the time permit themselves to, they felt that they were at a certain level and playing rock and roll was perhaps a little bit beneath them and they didn't want to get into it, whereas our guys, we welcomed the rock and roll.
I had 3 kids to earn a living, and that's it. And the money was important to pay the rent. And so I did what all the rest of the guys did. I got a Fender guitar and put the light gauge strings where you could bend them from here to Christmas and listen to some of the people that were doing this in the rock groups. And I got so I could play that stuff better than they could.
The very first call I had ever had at Disney, we got there 11:45, and all the Blue Blazers were leaving. And we're all sitting there, and he makes a little speech about, ladies and gentlemen, we brought you in here because in this particular film, we're going to do some of your rock and roll music.
Your rock and roll music?
Yeah, there's a little scene here, and we're going to show it to you. And it was a quick little scene. So he says, now we have all the music for you. It's there in front of you, and we're going to do this to what we call a click track. Like we didn't know anything was going on. We're going to run the click very slow so that you can all learn, study, and memorize this music. And then he said, Marianne, play the click much slower. Well, she accidentally hit it, and the minute we heard 8 clicks, ding, 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 we're in, and we played this thing front to back. And when we finished, this guy said, you did it perfect. I wish we'd have made that.
Made it.
How in the world could you do that? And Tommy said, well, we practiced a lot during the day.
It was perfect because they thought you were a complete idiot.
It was unbelievable.
Most of the music and the money, I was about to say, was a Freudian slip, but true, came out of the Brill Building in New York. It was New York-based, New York writers, New York singers, New York musicians.
The music business was in New York City, period, at that time.
Rolling, Master A, take 1. Here we go, rolling.
Say Chess Records back in Cincinnati. But there were only maybe 1 guitar player, 1 bass player, 1 piano player, so they could almost get held up by those 1 or 2 guys. When they could come to Los Angeles, And it wouldn't matter if they could call a matter of 10 or 12 different guitar players. All of them would be equally as good to do what they wanted done. Plus, we had more studios out here.
A lot of the musicians that were back east and in Nashville, a lot of them came out here to seek their fame and fortune. This was an untapped place for new artists to record, too.
Lee Hazelwood told me he went back to New York to do a session, and he just kind of walked over to the guitar player and said, "Hey, could you play me this little thing?" And the guy said, "Write it out." The guy just refused to experiment and try anything. Like if it wasn't written out, he wasn't going to play it. You had young musicians who were willing to contribute and come up with ideas, you know. I think that was the difference.
I don't think it's any secret. The 60s called all of the music to the West. LA was the place to be. If you wanted the best, they were right here in Los Angeles.
It was a rougher, looser sound than what was coming out of New York. Having a lot to do with, I guess, the musicians that we were using, because they were fresh to the sound.
Hell, you started the surf, and Earl started that double time, you know, because we were bored. We go tune gong bong gong tune gong bong. Oh yeah, tune tune do 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 do. You know, we doubled it up and made it swing.
Yeah, it was sort of like East Coast, West Coast jazz. There was really a distinct difference, and for those years, the record producers chose the West Coast.
Yeah,
and the hits started coming out of here.
This is where the youthful movies were being made. Everybody wanted to be a surfer, whether you were white or black or lived in the middle of the desert. You wanted to have a surfboard. It was crazy. And along with that came young music, and it was created here.
Beach beauties everywhere, and art lovers willing to look. This is paradise for thousands of sun worshippers, Californians by birth or adoption.
And I remember the perfumed air, the night blooming jasmine, and all the kind of plants that grow in Southern California, and how dreamy it all was. It's the sound of the Beach Boys kind of wafting through from house to house, you know, almost the same records just repeating. And the idea that, hey, this is real, this is the culture here, is this beach thing.
The Beach Boys! Thank you very much. Right now we'd like to show you how the Beach Boys go about making a record. We start with Denny Wilson on the drums. Followed by Al Jardine on rhythm guitar. Helped out by Carl lead guitar Wilson. And filled out instrumentally by our leader Brian Wilson on the bass. When we're ready to sing, we step up at the microphones and it comes out something like this.
I went to Gold Star and I met the musicians that played for Phil Spector, and I immediately had Steve Douglas start booking. They're called the Regulars, the Wrecking Crew. They started booking them for me in my studio in Western.
Session players were brought in by producers for a variety of reasons. In fact, most of the mid-1960s Beach Boys backing tracks didn't feature any of the Beach Boys. It was Brian Wilson's decision to push the music to another level. And to do that, he enlisted the best of L.A.
When I heard that some of the guys sat in for some of the Beach Boys, that surprised me. But in truth, at that point, the Beach Boys were Brian Wilson. He created it all.
He was very self-assured, very much in control. He brought in the charts that he wrote himself. And most of the time, I mean, the music was entirely his. I mean, there were very few times that we made up licks on his stuff.
Yeah. He had in his head what he wanted.
First album was Summer Days and Summer Nights, the Beach Boy album. Ray Pullman was a great bass player, really good. Steve Douglas was like so on the mark as a saxophone player. He just blew my mind. He played with such finesse, you know. And he used to get real close to the microphone to get the best benefit of his instrument. They were all, the record, they're just great.
Brian was a genius. I mean, he was just... He was as good as I've ever seen, I believe, about putting things together.
Pet Sounds was an incredibly important record and still stands there like, okay, top this, you know. George Martin told me Sgt. Pepper was an attempt. He said an attempt to equal Pet Sounds. So it was an incredibly influential record. And I think it had an electromagnetic field, and people were drawn here and wanted to be a part of that and wanted to make records like that.
Good Vibrations, we must have did 25, 30 sessions.
It might take 6 months, too.
Some days that we worked 5 minutes, some days we worked 4 hours.
On the same song.
We experimented, and they would ask me, well, what do you want? And I'd say, well, I don't know, you know. And we'd go home, and the next time we get together, then we would fall together, and we'd do the thing.
3 months, 2-3 dates a week, but Capitol Records was picking up the tab.
And we liked to work for him. The word was, do you have the date with Brian Wilson tomorrow? I said, yeah, I do. Oh, good.
Well, Carol played on Good Vibrations and California Girls, and she was like the star of the show. I mean, she was the greatest bass player in the world. And she was way ahead of her time. She would play a tonic and a fifth or a third instead of a fifth, you know. She was one of the first bass players to start playing that way.
But he definitely wrote out some neat lines on the bass, like, for instance, I'd have never played that. I'll just go into this. Now, that's a jazz walking line. You knew that this kid was into something really, really great.
The room had a spirit to it, with Hal being the leader, you know, and all the guys working together and thumping and pumping.
He would get things like he wanted to hear them. And when he got them that way, it was good. When I heard Good Vibrations the first time on the radio, it just blew me away.
She's somehow closer now. Softly smile, I know she must be kind. In her eyes, she goes with me to a blossom room.
Very good.
I remember Carol, though, I still have to remember, because her favorite thing, no matter what date we went on after that, would you like me to use my Beach Boy pick? And so she'd have pressed the shit out of this one.
She
and then
picked it up on the way to the studio.
And they're looking at this pick, and they're looking at her.
Yeah, to sell it, you know.
She was selling this shit like I couldn't believe. One little pick made this girl hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I was very jealous of the guitar when we were first dating and got engaged, and he paid a lot more attention to the guitar, I felt. So I gave him an ultimatum, it's me or the guitar. And he said, honey, the guitar doesn't have legs, you do. He got so upset with him, I took my ring and I threw it at him. Then I went looking for it.
And I was one of these late starters in life. I wasn't one of these guys that you read about in the books. You know, you read these articles in Guitar Player magazine, the guy says, well, when I was 12 years old, I had the chops of a reindeer and all this stuff. You know, when I was 12 years old, I was playing marbles myself. I don't know, you know. And when I was 24, I was at Douglas Aircraft, you know, moving boxes and trying to play guitar. I was 24, I was still into this. Wow, I'm in a 7th position. Whoa, yeah. And I finally learned one hip chord. Whoa. So I'm not one of them guys you read about.
We went to the prom and Ralph Martiri was playing the dance and found out that their guitar player was leaving that night. And he tried out, auditioned, and he was hired right then and there. It was on a Friday night, and a Saturday night he left for New York City.
the truth.
Okay, he got let go. Martiri was going to get a guitar singer so that he could only pay for one guy. He decided he knew there was nothing there in Niagara Falls for him. He wanted to go to California to play.
While my father struggled to find work playing guitar, he had to make ends meet working in a warehouse. He always said it was the best job he ever had. He hated it so much it made him practice every day.
I was told by two guys before we left, he's never going to make it. So after 7 months of struggling here, Daddy wanted to go back. And I said, there's no way, because I wasn't giving in to those two guys. And that's what Dad said, my stubborn Sicilian wife.
In fact, my wife was behind me 100%, like all the time I worked, and you'd swear she was working. She took the calls, she never complained. I would come in at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock. I'd see my kids whenever. My wife accepted it. This was our living. Our whole family took it exactly that way. Every once in a while, a musician's wife would come and complain to her, and she'd talk to them. She'd say, well, look, that's his living.
Well, Carmi never talked to Barbara the Barbarian.
My father would say there are only 4 reasons to take a gig. For the money, for the connections, for the experience, or just for fun.
I got to tell you a story about your dad. We were in Western Studio 3 there, and Jan Berry of Jan and Dean, he counted the song. Everybody ready? Okay. Tedesco started playing. And Jan said, stop, wait. He went over and looked, and he said, Tedesco, what are you doing? Tommy, the music was upside down, and Tommy was reading it backwards. Now, that's a true story. But you talk about getting a laugh out of it. Tommy was a cut-up.
Every evening when the sun goes down, I lay my head.
Darlene?
There was an energy that Philip would get. I remember Philip would be so excited about every session. There was just a vitality in the room that would lift you off of your feet. And also, there'd be so many players, and the sound would be so huge. I mean, it was definitely that wall of sound was really there. I never was in the studio that there were any different guys. It was the same guys always.
The wall of sound was the Gold Star Echo Chamber.
Well, it was wall-to-wall musicians, first of all.
Yeah, that's true.
Most people used a 4-piece rhythm section. He had 4 guitars, or 6 or 7. There were 4 pianos always, 1 upright bass, 1 Fender bass. I mean, it was only 1 drums usually. 15 people playing percussion instruments.
In a very small room.
Yeah.
Not a small room, but an average room.
And a huge echo chamber that Gold Star was famous for.
Ceramic,
that was the wall of sound.
Ceramic walls.
1, 2, 3. Every evening when the sun goes down.
The wall of sound of Phil Spector is more like a lost feeling. It's heavy on you've lost that love and feeling. And it was he used the echo so much, and it was swimming all the time. In spite of the baffles, we all leaked into each other's mics, just enough to give it the combination of leakage and echo. Plus, we were tired. By the 30th take, you're tired. So it had a real relaxed feeling on his hits.
You've lost that love and feeling, now it's gone, gone, gone. Whoa.
It's the most played song of all time.
Oh, I believe it.
Most played record of all time.
They were the whole sound that Philip had. Philip was also really, really superstitious, and he wanted those guys, and he always wanted those guys. He felt secure, only secure when he was playing with those guys.
Same musicians, same engineers, same studio, same probably brand of tape.
Yeah, probably. It was just a thing that he figured if he didn't do it that way, it wouldn't be a hit.
He was probably right. He was probably right, and we're grateful for that.
You know, Philip was walking in a different universe than everybody else, and so in his mind, it was all him, you know, and the guys were just some sort of an extension of what he couldn't do.
Phil would never record anything for the first 3 hours. I mean, he worked these guys so that they weren't playing individualistic. They were too tired, and so they just melded into this wall of sound.
Phil leaned on Howard very, very heavy about how to play and just kept on it and on it and on it and wasn't satisfied or something and made him kept playing over and over and over and over again for hours until Howard's hands were just a massive pain. No, this way. Howard says, look, man, if I can't play it and you know what it is, why don't you play it?
Howard Roberts, the only guy that I ever saw walk out of a session where he just put everything down, picked up his guitar and his amp, and he walked out. He said, I've had enough of this.
He was very demanding. I had no problem with Phil. I guess it's because he knew that I always knew that I wasn't the original drummer. Because if I'd had a problem, I'd have walked out. Who was he going to get? He'd already, had his argument with Hal. Maybe Hal wouldn't have came back. So we got along fine.
Well, they made fun of him all the time, but they really liked him. I think they really respected him. They thought he was nuts, which of course he was. But I think they always looked forward to it because it was always going to be something really cool. It was like a total friendship thing, too, because they would come in and they would be talking about, what'd you do on the golf course, or, someone had this car, or something. There was always a Mad magazine, too, being passed around that somebody brought,
I was in awe of them because of Phil Spector. That it took me a couple of times to get used to, being with the guys.